in this example, white has a rook in e6 and a king in e5. Black has two pawns, one in c3 and one in d3, and then the black king is in h3. Now, how does white win this game? The two black pawns seem pretty dangerous, but at the same time, the black king is on the last file, on the h file, and the white king is quite close to him. At the same time, it's also quite close to the pawns. So now here, white has to play very careful. Now, the first move is rook to c6. Now, black can try either c2 or d2. If black plays d2, then that comes with check. Rook takes c3 comes with check, which allows then the black rook from c3 to reach d3 and easily pick up the last pawn. So black has to play c2, and after c2, now white will continue with king f4. Now this is important, and in this type of patterns, it's important to remember that we have to create a threat with the with our king. See if we can start an opposition with the opponent's king, and then eventually give some mate threats. So that's important. Now here, there's no other move but pawn to d2, because, well, obviously pawn to c1 is not to be considered because the rook is on the file. So black king to h4 is nonsense because of the checkmate, and black king to h2 or g2, we can look at h2, but this just gives white the time for his king to approach the pawns and eventually just pick up both of them. So king e3, and then king g2, for instance, and now white can just pick up the pawn. The same would have happened if black had picked g2 first. So the white king had made a clever move when he reached f4, the clever move of getting close to the opponent's king and at the same time get close to the opponent's pawns. So now black only, his only move is pawn to d2, and now here's the tactic. So feel free to pause the video and see how does white win this game. Now, very simple. Rook to c3 check. Now, black king could either reach the second rank or the fourth rank. So if he goes anywhere in the second rank, white rook can take the pawn and pin the other pawn, the d pawn, and then eventually pick it up. If black king goes to h4, the exact same thing happens. So here we're pinning the pawn not to the king but to the square of checkmate, which means that if black promotes right now into a queen, whatever, even into a knight or anything, here comes with the checkmate. In this example, white has a rook in c8 and a king in f6. Black has a pawn in a4 and a pawn in b2, and his king is in h7. Now, white can win this game. How? White has to create threats of checkmate with his rook. The situation is pretty desperate here for the white player. At least it looks desperate because this pawn is close to promotion, and this the pawn in a4 is about to go and help the b pawn. So white has to start with the check. Now, black can either go h8 or g8 or h6. If he goes h6, here the move is rook forking. So now promoting into a queen or any other piece doesn't really help because the checkmate comes and the queen from b1 has no way to interfere. If king chooses h8, now it's important not to play king g6. Always have a look at the promotion square. Pawn promoting in b1 into a queen will come with check. So king g6 in case the idea is rook to c8 checkmate. So king g6 doesn't work. Now white has to play rook b7 to attack the pawn. Black's only move is pawn to a3, and now king g6. Now that the rook is also guarding the file. So king g6 now is unstoppable checkmate. Or well, if not unstoppable checkmate right now, it's definitely a win for white now, because the black player could choose to promote, but then rook picks up the pawn in b1, then eventually reaches a1 and picks up the other pawn. So doesn't really make much difference. And last option, in case king picks up g8. Now king g6 is again a mistake because of the promotion square that comes with check. So now white has to first give a check to the king, forcing the king either to f8 or h8. If king goes to f8, now rook to b7 is a fork, attacks the pawn and forks the checkmate square. And if king chooses h8, now rook goes to b7, which gives the same situation as before. The king is now able to reach g6 and prepare the unstoppable checkmate. Now here white has a rook in d6 and a king in e7. Black has a king in g8 and then a pawn in a4 and a pawn in b2. So just like the previous example, black has two very threatening pawns. Now how does white win this game? So the first move here has to be rook to g6, and now black can either play h7 or h8. Now h7 loses quickly. Rook plays to b6. Now attacking the pawn in b2. Only move is pawn to a3, and now king f7. Now the black king cannot reach h6 because it's checked by the rook, and he can only go to h8, or he's got to push the pawn to a2. Now this is the same situation. The fact that we played the king opposition, so this is important, allows us to make a fork, and the fork is rook to b2, attacking the pawn in a2 and the checkmate square. So after the check, black can choose to go to h8, which white responds again with b6, rook to b6, stopping the pawn from promoting. Now black plays pawn to a3, and white has to play king to f8. Again, the threat of checkmate is in h6, which means that black cannot push his pawns. The pawn in b1 will be taken straight away, and the pawn in a2 will be too slow to stop the checkmate. So black is forced to play king to h7, and now again king to f7, creating the opposition between the two kings. And now black is in the same situation as it was before. If pawn pushes to a2, then pawn to a2, then rook takes pawn with checkmate threat, or just picking up the other pawn. And now black has no other moves except king h8, which gives the same result.